Hello, and welcome to Pro Central Virginia's Lunch and Learn with our broker who is speaking today, Mike Metzger with Murphy Business Sales. And he has a great presentation lined up about exit strategy planning. And Mike, I'm going to turn it over to you.
All right. Hey, thanks so much, Sherry. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you and with Pro of Central Virginia. As Sherry mentioned, I'm a business broker, so I'm a business intermediary. I specialize in helping owners of profitable, well-established small businesses determine the value of those companies and then go to market confidentially to find the right buyer at the best price. So today I thought I'd talk a little bit about exit strategy planning and what buyers are looking for in a business. The more knowledge that you have, the more educated you are and can prepare your business for sale, whether it's next year or 10 years from now. And again, we have a pretty small group, so I'd like to keep it fairly conversational. If you all have any questions, just jump right in and I'm happy to talk through those. So getting started. There we go. I like to tell business owners that one way or another, your business is going to end, or at least your involvement in the business is going to end. And being proactive can allow you to kind of choose what that looks like. So you could simply close the doors, liquidate, sell your inventory, and shut the business down. That's obviously not ideal in most cases, because you're probably leaving some money on the table. A lot of business owners have a succession plan where they plan to give the business or sell the business to their daughter or to their son, or even to some key employees. We often find that family member succession plan, despite the best of intentions, sometimes falls apart because when Junior goes off to Harvard and gets his MBA, he suddenly doesn't want to run Dad's dry cleaning business anymore. So you kind of got to go to plan B, which in this case could be the sale of the business on the open market. And that's really where I specialize in finding those third-party arm's length buyers. So the bottom line here, though, is you want to do this on your terms. So you'd rather use a planned exit than a forced exit. I've had many cases where a business owner may have some terminal illness or some family emergency that requires that they have to sell the business tomorrow, and they haven't thought about it at all. So getting ahead of the curve is obviously beneficial. That's a little mom and apple pie. So why do people sell their business? Various reasons. Obviously retirement's a big one, and I'd say probably 75% of the clients that I work with are thinking about retirement. But also I'll get a lot of kind of mid-career folks in there, let's say their 40s. Say, I've built this business over 20 years, but I want to do something else, and I've still got some runway ahead of me, and I want to sell this and move on to greener pastures. There could be divorces, illnesses, like I mentioned, relocation, any number of reasons. So let's talk about who buys businesses. There's a couple different types of buyers, and this is important to understand as well. We already talked about family succession, so that last item is family members. If you're passing your business down to your kin, that's one thing. But the types of the types of buyers that I look for are threefold. The first is the individual buyer. And this is the guy or the gal coming out of corporate America, or maybe leaving another company and wants to run his or her own business. Career changers. We're seeing a lot of that right now. Everyone's heard of the Great Resignation, where people are leaving their corporate jobs. This whole COVID pandemic maybe caused them to reassess their lifestyle and their careers and maybe take control of their own destiny. So we work with a lot of individual buyers who are in many respects buying a job, so to speak. Then there's the strategic buyers. A strategic buyer is generally another company that's already in the industry or a related industry. So let's say, for instance, a roofing company decides to buy a gutter company. Those are complementary businesses. That's a strategic play and a horizontal acquisition. Or you could have a roofing company buying another roofing company simply to grow market share and buy customers in the area. So those are strategic buyers, and we do work with a number of them as well. And then last, there's financial buyers. We consider these the private equity groups, family offices, investment funds. They have any number of different strategies and goals for what they try to do, but generally they're portfolioing companies. Sometimes they'll improve them and flip them and turn them right around. Other times they'll buy and hold. They'll put their own management teams in place. So there's a lot of different scenarios there, but those are the financial buyers that we work with. They're generally looking for bigger companies with, let's say, $1 million plus in EBITDA. Those are, fewer. But those are the types of buyers that we're looking for. Now, this page, I'll spend a little time on this. This is probably the most important page that I'll talk about today. This is what buyers are looking for in a good business. And understanding this now as a business owner, or if your friends or clients are business owners, understanding this now will help you get the business ready for sale. Again, whether it's next year or 10 years from now. Some of this is pretty obvious, but I'll emphasize it nonetheless. The first one is proven books and records. Excuse me. The buyers and the bankers, they're going to scrutinize your P&L statements, your balance sheets, your income statements, your tax returns, all of your financials. So the cleaner that those are, the better. I can't tell you how many times I see people intermingling personal expenses and business expenses. We all do it to some extent, but we really shouldn't. We really should keep those things distinct and separate, because I've got to kind of unwind that when I have to prepare the financials for a lender or for a buyer. And it also can raise some questions, especially if you do it a lot. I mean, I've seen people charging their mortgages, their kids' college payments,
wow.
their Jamaican vacation, charging that stuff to the books. And then I've got to back it out and explain that to the buyer. So keep the books clean. Again, that's pretty obvious. But then also make sure that the books match the tax returns. I've had that happen before too, where I'll look at the P&L statement, I'll say, man, this is a great business, really profitable, nice bottom line. And then I get the tax returns and I'm like, wait a second, what's happening here? These things are telling different stories. Angela, I think you mentioned this beforehand. We were talking about this just briefly before the meeting, but we as business owners all try to minimize the bottom line, because we want to minimize the amount of taxes we have to pay to Uncle Sam. Completely legitimate, legal, fair, nothing wrong with that. Part of my job as a broker is to adjust that net income to understand how much cash the business actually produces for the owner, because that's going to be key in deriving the proper value of the company. We call that recasting the financials. So I will add back things like the owner's salary, some of those personal expenses, one-time non-operating expenses, things like that. So we really want to understand how much cash the business produces for the owner. I'll come back to that in just a little bit. Reasonable price. So this one's kind of obvious. If you overprice the business, you're not going to get any market response. If you underprice the business, you're leaving money on the table. So it pays to really understand the proper value of the company before you even go to market. Some people will take it to market and say, I want $2 million for my business. They just arbitrarily throw up a target price with no reasonable expectation that anyone would ever pay for that and or pay that price. And that just sets false expectations. The next one is leverage and terms. So is it a bankable business? Will a bank finance this transaction? I'd say probably 75% of the deals that I do involve some sort of lending, and it's most often in the small business world, it's most often SBA lending. So SBA 7A primarily. But in some cases, if a business is not bankable, in other words, well, it could be any number of reasons for that. But if a bank won't finance it, you may have to consider owner financing, where the seller actually becomes the bank and holds a note for some period of time in order to help the buyer purchase the business. And there can also be good reasons to do some owner financing, even in a bankable business, even if it's a 10% note. Most people kind of blanch at that when I say seller financing. But again, there are times when it really is, it makes a lot of sense. And I won't dig too deep into that right now. Good cash flow, we just talked about. The cash flow is the basis for valuing the company. FF&E, which is furniture, fixture, and equipment, properly valued. Equipment is the buyer is purchasing the company's equipment and will begin a new depreciation schedule on that equipment, which is why it's important to understand the actual fair market value of the equipment, not the book value. The book value, in most cases, in many cases, I should say, you, the seller, have depreciated it down to zero, so it's worth nothing on the books, but it truly does still have some market value, so we need to understand what that looks like. The facility. So, again, when you sell a house, you stage the house. You get it looking nice before you start bringing prospective buyers in. You should do the same thing with your business. The facility should be clean. It should be safe. It should be well lit. I've walked into a number of places where I kind of look around. I'm like, is this place even open? Is it even operating? So appearance of the facility is important. Your reputation of the business is important. As we all know, everybody has access to Google and online reviews. So your reputation is right there front and center for everyone to see. I've actually had deals fall apart because a buyer, after investigating the business, found a couple negative comments in some Google review. And as we all know, it's quite often just some malcontent with an axe to grind. But nonetheless, this buyer looked at that and said, man, I don't like what I see, I'm backing out. So managing those online reviews and that online reputation is important. Favorable lease terms on the facility. In some cases, the seller may own the real estate. So it's important to understand if you want to sell that with the business or if you're consider leasing it to the buyer, which can actually be a pretty nice annuity stream. You guys get this as you go into retirement or whatever your next opportunity is. Seller training, there's generally some expectation that the seller is going to stick around for some period of time afterwards to help educate the new owner, to transition client relationships and so forth, processes. So expect that. A covenant not to compete, non-compete agreement. Almost every buyer is going to expect you to sign a non-compete. And again, the fear there is, I sell Mason, my HVAC company. Mason's concern is that I go open Mike's HVAC 2 right down the street 6 months later, and I start stealing customers. And obviously that's not my intent, but he's going to expect me to put that in writing. Good reason for sale. This one, a good reason is not I want to sell because my business sucks and I'm miserable and I'm losing money. No one's going to buy that, right? There are some distressed sales out there. It's not anything that I do, and I don't know any buyers looking for that stuff. Employees are willing to stay. We'll talk a little bit more about employees here in a minute as well. No last minute surprises. I always tell people, listen, when you're preparing your business for sale, if you've got some warts on it, that's okay. Just disclose that up front. Let's say your general manager is 64 years old and is planning to retire at 65. It's probably something you should let the buyer know, as opposed to letting him find that out or her find that out during the due diligence period and the whole thing blows up. And then last but not least, and probably one of the most important ones on this page, is the independence from the seller. So the number one reason that small businesses don't sell, in my experience for sure, but statistically as well, is if the business is entirely built upon on the owner. So for instance, Jeremy may have a fantastic business, great sales, growing year over year, it's very profitable, but if all of the knowledge is in his head, and if all of the client relationships are directly, between him and the clients, the buyer's going to get really concerned and say, man, Jeremy, you've got a great company. I love what you've done, but I'm just afraid when you leave, this whole thing falls apart. So to the extent that you can, as a business owner, that you can start to delegate responsibilities and distance yourself from the value stream, that will make the sale a bit easier. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as well. Any questions on that before I move on? Okay. All right, so let's talk a little bit about pricing a small business. Many people think that businesses are sold as a multiple of sales. So if I make $1 million, I should be able to get two times sales. I should be able to get $2 million for the company. Well, that's not the case. That's not how we price most small businesses. There are some exceptions, but most businesses are valued as a multiple of earnings, the seller's discretionary earnings, not the sales or the assets. So here's where I get, okay, so we use the market method to determine that multiple. Bear with me, y'all. This is where I get into the math a little bit. There's even going to be an equation here, but I promise it'll be painless and we'll be done with it quickly. So,
and there's no quiz at the end, right? No quiz.
No, there is a quiz. There's a big quiz. No, there's not.
Go.
Okay. So the way that we price a business, we look at the seller's discretionary earnings. That's what I talked about. That's the amount of cash that the business produces for the owner after you've paid all operating expenses like wages, rent, cost of goods, et cetera, but before you've taken any benefit out, salary, health insurance, that Jamaican vacation, whatever. We call that seller's discretionary earnings. Then we apply a market multiple, and that's where we use the market method. I go out and I look at comparable sales. to see what multiple actual transactions have gone for. And we apply that and we get a sales price. So that's kind of the science piece of it. It's a little bit of an art and a science. That's the science piece, if you will. But that, actually, let me talk about the multiple real quick. Those market multiples, don't take this as gospel. These are just kind of ballparks. The point here is that you can see that the multiple goes up, tends to go up the bigger the deal. So the average for business, this actually is accurate. The average for businesses with under $500,000 in gross sales is about 2.3 times earnings, whereas the average of businesses with sales between 2 and 5 million is closer to 3.5 times earnings. Now that multiple can vary. So again, please don't take that as gospel. It just kind of shows you the fact that bigger businesses generally command higher multiples. But here's the art piece. Here's where it gets a little more interesting, because you can't just simply apply that multiple and expect that to be, you know, the final say. And here's why. Let's take a look at a couple hypothetical companies here. Can everyone see this okay? Okay. So 2021, we got company A did 12 million in gross sales. So did company B. They both got about 1.5 million in cash flow. And let's just say we are going to apply a 3x multiple here. Each of these companies would hypothetically be worth about 4.5 million. Make sense so far? Okay. Now, but that's not the whole story. I think we need to dig a little deeper. As you look deeper and you look at past years, you can see company A in 2019, they had 6 million in gross sales. 2020, they had 8 million. 2021, they had 12 million. So they've kind of had a nice steady sales growth progression over the last 3 years. But look at company B. Company B, even though they're at 12 million this year, that's great, except that's a 50% drop since 2019. So they've been on the opposite trend, on a downward trend. So now do we still think that they're worth the same? Probably not. There's some other factors to consider as well. So company A's got $1.5 million debt on the company. Company B's got $7 million in debt. Interesting. Company A's equipment's pretty new, 3.5 years old. Company B's got old junky equipment, 20 years old. You get the point. Owner's comp, 350,000 on company A, guy in company B's taking 100,000. So suddenly these companies don't look so similar, and obviously would not be valued the same way. Owner's vacation. This is another question I love to ask people: is when's the last time you took a 2-week vacation? Sometimes the owner will chuckle and say, I took last weekend off. Sometimes they'll say, hey, we go to the islands every April for 2 weeks every year. And that demonstrates that they have the ability to step away from the business and they can continue without them. Okay. Any questions so far up to that point? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the pandemic and what I'm seeing. This is just kind of my observations in the Richmond market, the Central Virginia market, if you will, post-pandemic. So a few things have not changed. Main Street businesses are still sold as a multiple of cash flow. We talked about that. I showed you a couple scenarios. That has not changed. It's still a seller's market. And by that, I mean that if you've got a good, solid business that's performing well, has good cash flow, and is sellable, is attractive to a buyer, there are buyers out there. We talked about that great resignation and the buyer pool. So I can sell those businesses, all day long. Interest rates still remain low for now. They're starting to creep up, and we've all seen that. But what this means is that as interest rates increase, capital availability decreases, and again, based on the buyer's liquidity, it may reduce the amount of company they can buy with their dollar. So that's going to start tightening that buyer market soon. I predict by the end of the year we're going to see that start to throttle back a little bit. Whether it'll turn into a full buyer's market, I don't know, but we'll see. Nonetheless, buyers are still looking for the fundamentals, and I won't beat this horse because we just talked through these. They're still looking for strong cash flow. They're looking for clean books. They're looking for that independence from the owner, or the ability to transition from the old owner to the new owner. They want to see a good, clean facility with decent lease terms. They want a strong employee base. This is important as well. Actually, let me talk about this for just a second. Actually, you know what? I'm going to come back to that when I get to the what has changed slide. A viable industry. They honestly are, obviously you want to see a growing, viable current industry. It's hard to sell a buggy whip company. You should be in a growing industry. It's got to be priced properly. We talked a little bit about that. Non-compete, we talked about. The seller transition. So the seller should be willing to spend some time helping to transition the business to the new owner. In most cases, there is, it's assumed, or it's not assumed, but it's customary, if you will, to provide some free transition time, whether that's 2 weeks or 4 weeks, whatever. It's generally expected that the seller is going to stick around for some period of time for free to help transition the business. In many cases, especially if it's a business that's highly dependent on that seller, there may be an employment agreement that says, listen, we'll do the first 30 days for free, but then I'll stay on for another 30 days at X salary or X rate of pay, or I could stay on as a consultant for some period of time. So there's a lot of ways to shape those employment agreements, but that's not uncommon. Okay, so let's talk about what has changed since the pandemic, at least in my perspective, from my point of view. So first of all, there are more buyers. We talked about that because of the Great Resignation. I've also seen, we talked about the financial buyers, the private equity groups. I've seen them start to come down in the market a little bit, looking at smaller businesses, much smaller than they would have before, simply because there's a dearth of good quality businesses. They can't find those 1 million plus EBITDA companies to buy. So they're coming down, dipping a little bit deeper into the well, if you will, which is interesting. Sector concerns. So, you know, there's always been certain sectors that are more attractive than others, but the ones that I see that are particularly tough right now, and probably not a big surprise, restaurants. Restaurants are always tough to sell for any number of reasons, but they're even tougher now because the ones that did survive the pandemic still have a lot of other issues that they've got to address. But I also get the sense that there's still a little bit of buyers are a little bit afraid about of the other shoe dropping. You know, what happens if we get another wave of this virus and we go through shutdowns again, and I got to shut the restaurant down, but I've still got to pay the debt that I owe to the SBA, or to the bank rather. So lots of concerns about restaurants. Retail's always been, I shouldn't say always, but certainly in the last 10 years, because of the Amazon effect, retail's been tough. A lot of small retailers have closed shop. They just can't compete with online businesses. I will say there are still some specialty retailers that can still be very attractive and very profitable. But by and large, the retail sector is difficult. I talked about employees, and I deferred that a minute ago, but there are certainly labor concerns out there. And my guess is everyone on this call has seen this as well. Every business owner I've talked to in the last year has said, I just can't find the right people. I can't find enough of them, and I can't keep them. There's been so much churn and turnover in the labor markets right now that that concerns buyers, especially if you're in a labor-intensive business where you need a lot of employees, or especially a lot of kind of entry-level employees. There's concern about the labor market, and I think that will.
Mike, is that more pronounced in our industry since skilled labor is at such a shortage and there's such a workforce development crisis?
I think it is. I think it is. And in many respects, it comes down to, and you hate to say this, but it's just who's paying the highest. You know, and you guys have seen it, right? You'll get a great employee who will jump and go to your competitor for 50 cents more an hour, right? You hate to see that, but it does happen. Which is why I think it's important to, and I'm going to talk about this on my advice page on the next one, 2 pages down, do what you can to keep those employees, keep them happy, and incent them to stay. I think this will kind of slow down this year. It feels like the labor market is starting to loosen up just a little bit, but we'll see. We'll see. The other thing that I heard, I know y'all heard this too last year, is no one wants to work because the government's paying them to stay home. Right? I mean, they were sitting on the couch watching Oprah and getting the government cheese instead of getting out there and working. And I think that's starting to go away as well. By the way, for what it's worth, I think that was a terrible idea, but we'll talk about that later. All right. Lenders are super cautious. So remember, when a buyer is financing a business, the lender is really a business partner. They're in it with you for usually 10 years or more. So they're going to scrutinize the business. And I've seen in the last 2 years, they're digging way deeper than they used to. They used to say, well, show me your last 3 or 4 years of financials. I'm going to look at your tax returns. We're going to do some basic underwriting. I see them now going back. They're looking at, show me 2008. I want to see your financials from 2008 during the last major recession or downturn. I want to see how you weathered that storm. Show me your last 2 years of bank statements so I can see cash flows in and out of your accounts. They're getting pretty detailed, which is okay. You just need to understand that that's the expectation. So I see 3 types of businesses coming out of this last 2 years of pandemic and recession. The first one is the companies that just tanked. They tanked and folded, or frankly, they're insolvent right now and they should fold. They just haven't done it yet. There's a number of those, and we've all seen them, and it's tragic, but it's a fact. So I can't sell those. Again, there are some brokers who specialize in distressed company sales. I just don't do that. On the other hand, there's companies that actually thrived during the pandemic, and in some cases benefited from it. They even grew their company. And given all those other parameters I talked about, if those are in place, I can sell those all day long. There's buyers out there looking for those good, solid companies. Then there's the ones in the middle. There's the companies who are I call them hanging on. So in other words, they made it through the pandemic. Maybe they took the PPP loan, the EIDL loan, whatever. They survived, but they're still not quite back to where they were pre-pandemic levels. And those can be sold. There are buyers who will look at that, but it's a little more challenging. You've got to convince and to some extent assure them that you're back on track, or you've got a trajectory to get back to those pre-pandemic levels. So that's kind of what I'm seeing there. So my advice to sellers, start thinking about your exit strategy now. Obviously, you don't want to be doing this a month before you need to sell the company. And that happens all the time, by the way. I talk to business owners and say, Mike, I'm ready to sell my company and I want to have it sold by June 30th because we're moving to Florida. I'm like, well, Mr. Johnson, I'll do my best, but candidly, that's a long putt. If you look statistically across the entire small business spectrum, it takes, on average, and I hate to use averages here, but on average, it takes 10 months to sell a small business. But I've sold companies in 4 months, and I've sold companies in 3 years. It just depends on the particulars of the company, how attractive it is, finding the right buyer, and so forth. But from planning purposes, plan on a year in most cases. Optimize your business today to maximize the value. So all of those characteristics that I talked about earlier, if you can focus on those, as well as the obvious things like grow the top line, grow the top line and the bottom line, shrink your expenses and maximize that bottom line, that'll help you maximize value of the company. Get back to those pre-pandemic levels or better. So I must have talked to 20 or 25 companies last year that said, man, we're tired. We're ready to sell. We made it. We made it through the pandemic. The doors are still open. I'm ready to sell. And then I look at the books. I'm like, you're not ready to sell. You need to give it more time. You got to get back to those levels, or else you're just going to take a huge haircut on the value of the company. And no one wants to do that. So get back to those pre-pandemic performance levels. This one's big too. So demonstrate adaptability and resilience. Having gone through these last 2 very challenging years, companies that can show that they adapted their business model to respond to the changing climate can actually be really attractive. So I've talked to businesses who said, listen, I've completely shifted my business model to online. We shut the retail or the consumer facing shop, and we're all online. And you know what? Our margins have grown, our sales have grown, we're not going back. So showing that kind, or a restaurant that says, "Hey, we shifted to delivery instead of takeout, or sitting in dining rooms," showing that kind of resilience and adaptability can be really attractive to a buyer. So something to keep in mind. Solidify your workforce. We talked about that. If you've got good people, figure out how you keep them. And it's not always pay. Sometimes it can be some additional benefits. just acknowledging their contributions to the company, some of the intangible things that we call that the warm and fuzzy aspects of keeping employees, but do what you can to keep those folks on board, especially if you've got someone who's kind of in a GM position. Because again, when a buyer comes into the company, knowing that you, the seller, are going to step out, they're going to look to the workforce that you've got to say, hey, who's going to help me continue to run this business? If you've got a strong performing general manager in place, that can really help. Which I guess is actually the segue to the last bullet here, which is step back. Be able to step back from your business, start delegating to some of your skilled and talented workers, document the process knowledge that's sticking in your head. Don't make the business all about you. So that's again, just kind of mom and apple pie on that one. That is it. That I hope that that's helpful. Gives you some kind of insight into, if nothing else, the way buyers are thinking about businesses as they're out there looking for it, looking for a company to buy, and some ideas of things that you or your clients can start doing now to get your business ready for sale someday.
Mike, I have a question. Is there really a difference in the way a buyer looks at a business, tangible versus intangible sales? Or how do I put that? Repeating sales, like you're an architect, you design homes. You're not always going to get that client to come back next year, maybe 5 or 10 years down the road. But how do you evaluate that versus, Triscuits that are walking out the door?
Yeah. No, that's a good question. So recurring revenue is always attractive. So if you've got a paving company and you can say, listen, we've got half of our business is done with contracts with the state of Virginia or Chesterfield County, and those contracts are transferable. That's a whole other rat hole. We'll go down that one later. But if they can see that you've got that recurring revenue or some guarantees, if you will, of future revenue, that's attractive. If you're a very transactional business, you're not going to have that recurring revenue, and that may be okay too. But you want to demonstrate that you've got a strong track record of those sales, even though they're non-recurring. But recurring revenue is definitely attractive.
So just to jump in terms of follow up to Sherry's question, I guess in at least in our business, and maybe other remodelers that are in pro. We may not have that contractually obligated revenue stream or a business that, where we sell service contracts, right? Over a period of years, but we do have customers. And so when we look at our business, 60% of our business comes from past customers and referrals from those past customers.
Yeah.
We do advertise and things like that as well. And so we bring in organic customers as a result of our process, but, does that, maybe that goes to reputation. So I don't know if that has an inherent value, independent of that contractual revenue that you were just talking about.
Yeah, it certainly does, Jeremy. If you've got a good, solid reputation and you're getting a lot of word of mouth business, remodeling is a great example. People don't remodel their kitchen every year or two. It's usually every 10 or 15 years, right? So you may have a $30,000 contract with them this year or a deal with them this year and not hear from them again for another 10 years. And people understand that, buyers understand that. But if you've got a great reputation and that customer is telling 2 friends who tell 2 friends and tell 2 friends, and you're getting referral business like that, that's attractive. That certainly is attractive as well. It's different than recurring revenue, but
right.
it's nonetheless attractive.
Yeah. So what about business in the construction industry, residential? It's like masons and our business and others in our group. I know that you've sold some remodeling companies. What do you see the market for those businesses today? More specifically, drilling down from the higher level that we talked about in your presentation.
Yeah. No, good question. And I think, the fundamentals still apply. So if it's one of the challenges I see with contractors and remodeling businesses is kind of that owner dependence where It's really one main contractor. He's got a few subs doing jobs for him, but he or she is kind of the main show. They're the ones still going in and doing the quoting. They're doing the designing, really in some cases serving as a GC on the job. That can be tricky. So again, the fundamentals apply to the extent that you can delegate some of that stuff to some of your skilled employees. I think that helps make it sellable. The other, and this one's probably obvious too, but the other challenge, second biggest challenge with those types of businesses is finding someone who's got the proper licensing. So you're going to need somebody with a Class C contractor's license coming in. That can be tricky because not everyone can qualify for that.
Right.
Like you had a listing at one time, or at least were dealing with someone, I think, trying to sell their remodeling business. You mentioned something about that. What were the particular challenges with that?
Yeah, that was a few years ago. I know the one you're talking about, Mason. It's a design build remodeling company. And we had some interest. We did get a couple prospective buyers, but the biggest challenge was the business was built on that one guy.
Right.
He was the one who did all the designs. He met, like I said, he met with the clients. He did the estimating. Everything. And again, built a very nice business and had great reputation. But when the buyer looked at it, I said, well, what am I buying? I'm not buying you. I'm not buying the knowledge that's in your head. I'm buying this, the company that was built around you. And when you leave, I'm afraid that the whole thing folds. Now, again, there can be ways around that. There can be, if you've got somebody who's an existing contractor or remodeler who wants, really likes your brand, your reputation, even your employees and so forth. They may see it as a strategic play and could very well ask you to stick around for a year, right? They'll say, I want you to stick around for a year and help transition some of these relationships and help us, basically take the business, integrate the business into the buyer's company. So it can be done. It's not impossible. There's some challenges that you have to overcome with that. Last point that I'll make on that is sometimes you'll see, and again, I'm going down a little bit of a rat hole, so bear with me. But in businesses like that, where the business is very dependent on the seller, the company I just described is a good example. But also think about like an insurance agency, where the agent's the one out there selling the business and working with the customer, or even a dental practice where Dr. Mike is the guy drilling your teeth. It's a very personal relationship. In those types of businesses, we'll often see a tool that's used to share risk between the buyer and the seller. You may have heard of an earn-out. So an earn-out structure could say, for instance, Mason, I love your business. You got a great reputation. You got 10 employees who are fantastic, great website, super track record. But man, I'm just worried when you step away, this thing's going to fold. So I want you to share that risk with me. So I'm going to pay you half. I'll make this up. This is a hypothetical model, but I'm going to pay you, I'll gladly pay you $1 million for your company, but I'm going to pay you $500,000 up front. And the remaining $500,000 is going to be paid over the next 5 years based on some performance target or benchmark, which is quite often sales, but in the insurance book, it could be retention. So in other words, you're telling me, you, Mason, are telling me, Mike, don't worry about it. I guarantee you this, you're going to continue to hit the sales. You're going to grow sales. It's a great business. You shouldn't be worried. I say, well, I am worried. And if you're so sure of it, put your money where your mouth is. If I hit the sales year one, then I'll pay you an additional $100,000. If I hit the sales year two, you'll get your next $100,000. But if I miss those, that's going to be adjusted down. So if I only hit 75% of the sales next year, well, your payout's going to be 75%. So it's a way for the buyers and the sellers to share risk. And that was a very simplistic hypothetical example there.
You guys could talk to Thomas Sprouse about that because he did that with Creative Conservation when they, what is it, True something bought them?
True Team bought them. Yeah.
Yeah, he's now working for them for 2 years, and I think they're scheduled distributions.
Yeah.
I think it's hard for an owner to become an employee.
Mhm.
Oh, yeah.
That's my 2 cents.
I think there are different kinds of remodeling businesses as well. You know, whether it's design build, and mine relies a lot on my design, and but the handyman business, for instance, is a little more or probably a little less reliant upon me. And I don't know, Jeremy, in your businesses where you've got your replacement businesses and so forth, sort of very much like a large scale handyman business is to me. There's no design, you know, figure out how much, I may be oversimplifying it. So, but, you know, figure out how much siding and how much trim and how many windows and what they cost, and schedule your crews out to do that. That may not be Jeremy centric. Maybe he's not on.
No, I am. No, I mean, you know, I don't know that I can speak to that because while we started off as a replacement business, that's very far from where we are today.
Yeah.
We're a design remodel business on the inside as well as the outside. Siding is, you know, still something that we do because it's a legacy, really, division. And so we're still a James Hardie preferred remodeler, but you know, 80% of our revenues come from kitchen and bath remodeling and designing and building outdoor living spaces. So, so it's not as, you know, so our business is probably a little more design intensive than, well, probably a lot more design intensive than when we started 19 years ago. So, but I think to your point, Mike, I mean, do you have the people there? You know, we have a couple of salespeople, we have 2 project managers, you have craftsmen like, you know, like Mason does, you know, working in the field. You know, it's not a sub business. I mean, there is a structure to that business. And so I think to your point, the question is how much do our respective businesses rely on us to succeed?
Right.
Right. And
Yep.
so can we go away? Can we disappear? And will it still continue to run, you know, just as it does when we are here?
Yep.
So,
yeah.
And then it's really saleable.
That's right. That's right. Any other questions? Well, I hope you found that helpful, and I'm
Yeah.
Sorry, Sherry, go ahead. Did you have
No,
something?
I was gonna say, thank you, Mike. This has been very
Yeah.
helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, my
we
pleasure.
appreciate your time.
I'm
We have.
encouraged to take a 2-week vacation.
You should. You should, Mason. Just don't charge it to your business.
Right.
An
For nothing else,
educational
the
experience.
symbolism, Mason, the symbolism.
Yes.
Right.
Well, Mike, again, thank you. Mike is with Murphy Business Sales, Mike Metzger, and thank you guys for all being a part of the Lunch and Learn. I'm gonna upload this to our YouTube channel. So if you ever want to go back and watch it or send it to someone, please feel free to do that. And Mike, I hope you will join us at a future event sometime
I'd
soon.
love to.
We'd love to have you as a guest. So
Thank you. Yeah, I'd love to join.
all right. Well, thank you guys so much. And May 5th is our beer and barbecue. So hopefully we'll see everyone there.